Hi friends. All right, are you ready for the next chapters of Front Desk? When we left off, Mia had gone to the library to find out how much a hotel would cost, and the librarian found a contest, an essay contest, that she could enter for $300 to try and win a hotel. So Mia took the brochure and she was going to try and write an essay and try and find $300 so that she could enter into this contest. All right, let's start. Chapter 20. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, holding the book from the library, the one with the essay contest printed out in it. I couldn't wait to tell my parents. Before I could open my mouth, my mother looked at my book and frowned. "Another new book?" she said. You should be spending more time doing math, something you could actually get good at." Then she became all nostalgic. "You know, when I was your age, I used to eavesdrop on my brother's math lessons." Yeah, I didn't have time for this. "I'm not you, Mom," I exclaimed. The words just came shooting out of my mouth and my mom flinched. "I'm sorry. I just mean, maybe I like something else." "Like what?" she asked. She put her broom down and crossed her arms. I bit my lip. "Like writing." "English writing?" she asked. Like I was the most preposterous thing in the world? Like I just said basket weaving? I nodded. "You heard Mr. Yao. You gotta be native at English, and I'm sorry, but we're just not." "Mr. Yao? Since when was he an expert on anything other than meanness?" "You can, however, be native at math." "I don't want to be native at math." My mom frowned. "You're not getting it, are you?" she said. She sat down on the bed and looked at me in the eye. "You can't just be as good as the white kids in their language, honey. It's their language." My gaze sank to the floor. As I dragged myself out of the room, my mother called after me. "Someday you'll thank me." She's wrong, I told myself. She was wrong to the power of infinity. I thought about picking up the phone to call Lupe, but instead I flipped on the TV. A Return of the Simpsons was playing. I stared at Marge Simpson and her big hair and her easygoing smile. Marge, to me, was like the perfect American mom. So warm and forgiving that even if Bart was setting the house on fire, she'd continued chatting with her sisters on the phone. "Maybe he just needs more love," she'd say. Sometimes I wondered what it'd be like to have an American mom just for a day. I could eat all the chocolate chip cookies I wanted because American moms on TV were always baking them or making casseroles or organizing birthday parties with themes. I'll tell you what they're not doing. They're not pestering their kids to do more math. Whatever, I'd show her. She didn't even have to know about the essay contest. One day I'd just be like, "Hey, can you pass the chopsticks? Oh, and by the way, I want a motel." Mr. Yao's car roared into the motel and interrupted my daydreaming. I flipped off the TV, and as he and Jason walked up to the front office. "It's important, son, that you understand every part of the family business," Mr. Yao said to Jason as they stepped in. "But I don't understand why I have to do this now," Jason protested. "Do what now?" I asked. Mr. Yao flipped the front desk divider so that Jason could join me behind the desk. "Today, Jason's going to do your job," Mr. Yao announced. "He is going to check in customers." You've got to be kidding me. Jason was not a natural checker-inner. For one, he didn't have good customer service skills like me. No surprise there, but he did have basic problems figuring out the math. "So it's $20 a night plus tax," he told a customer while his father watched and I stood behind him. The customer gave him a $100 bill and wanted change. Jason struggled to calculate the tax, which in Anaheim, California was 13%. Do you have a calculator?" he asked me. "It's $22.60, I told him. I've checked in so many people by now. $22.60 was tattooed on my head. "Don't forget, I need 2 rooms, the customer reminded him. "Right," Jason said. He pulled out his hand and tried to do the math in the air with his fingers. "So that's 2 times $22.60, Mr. Yao yelled. Mr. Yao yelled, "You can't figure out what that is?" "Hang on, just give me a second," Jason said. He bit his lip. "You gotta carry the 1 and then add the..." Mr. Yao shook his head and stomped into the manager's quarters. After Jason finally figured out the math and gave the customer his keys, he went to find his father. He was in the kitchen. I did it. I checked in my first customer, Jason told his dad proudly. His father didn't say anything. Well, how'd I do? Jason asked. Mr. Yao breathed in and out like he was trying to contain a wildfire, and it was failing. How did you do? You were awful. A disgrace. All that using your fingers to do math? What are you, 5? Jason's face turned beet red. Your math isn't even as good as that girl's. Mr. Yao spat the words at him like he'd eyed Jason up and down. Gosh, you embarrass me. It was his first time, I said to Jason's defense. Yeah, well, he screwed up, Mr. Yao growled. He stared at Jason long and hard to make sure his words sank in. I looked down. I could see the whiteness of Jason's knuckles. Afterward, when Mr. Yao went out to talk to my parents, I walked over to Jason. He was sitting all by himself in the corner of the front office. I knew exactly what he was feeling because I had just felt it a couple of hours ago when my mom yelled at me. It's okay, I said softly. Jason shook his head. Don't, he said. I put my hand on his shoulder anyway. He jerked his body away. Just don't. Chapter 21. Pounding woke us up at dawn the next day. Ear-splitting pounding like someone was attacking the front office door with a jackhammer. I jumped out of bed. Mr. Lorenz, one of the customers from the night before, was standing at the front office. Quickly, my dad buzzed him in. My car! Mr. Lorenz shrieked. It's gone! Mr. Lorenz's neon green Ford Thunderbird had been taken in the middle of the night. He had parked it right in front of his room, room 5. When he woke up, it was gone. We have to find out who did this, I said, turning to my parents. You think it was one of the other customers? I immediately grabbed the customer logbook to see who had stayed there the night before. Could have been anybody, Mr. Lorenz said. Somebody could have come in here in the middle of the night and taken off with my car. I made a mental note, add parking lot gate to my wish list. My father picked up the phone. Hello, Mr. Yao, my dad said. Something terrible has happened. Mr. Yao arrived half an hour later. How could this happen? He said to my mom and dad, gesturing angrily with his hands. We don't know, my dad said. We were just as surprised as you. Mr. Yao picked up the phone and called the police. After that, he went around from room to room, waking up all the customers. Have you seen a green Ford Thunderbird? He asked them, peering suspiciously into their rooms. One of the guests said he did hear some noise around 3 a.m., like someone was trying to start a car. Mr. Yao turned to my dad. Did you see anybody leave at 3 a.m.? He asked. My dad sheepishly admitted that he didn't know he had been sleeping, to which Mr. Yao frowned and said, Stop sleeping! Mr. Yao then asked us if there were any customers who left without checking out. My dad and I went to check if anyone had gone in the middle of the night, and sure enough, when we went around, we found 5 keys. We gave Mr. Yao the numbers of the rooms and the names of the customers. Mr. Yao wanted to know what the customers looked like. I tried to describe them the best I could. Let's see. Mr. Roberto had a mustache, I said. It wasn't one of those long, curly, archy ones. It was one small and tidy one. It was a small and tidy one. And Mrs. Robinson, she was about the same height as my mom, a little taller. I closed my eyes, trying to recall the other details about her. She had long, curly black hair past her shoulders, not in braids like some of the other black women, I said. Mr. Yao's eyes bulged. Wait a minute. She's black? He yelled. I thought I told you not to rent to bad people. My throat went dry. I could hear the sound of my breathing, hard and fast. You said bad people, not black people. Any idiot knows black people are dangerous, Mr. Yao said. That's not true. I was stunned. Hank's not dangerous for one. I narrowed my eyes at Mr. Yao. You're not the one who's you're the one who's dangerous. Mia, my dad said. Nervously, my dad turned to Mr. Yao. Sir, we can't judge someone based on their color of their skin. It isn't right. This is America. Mr. Yao snorted. If you really believe that, then you're even dumber than I thought, he said. Clearly, you have no idea how this country really works. The sound of police cars pulling in made us look up. What's going on here? The police officers asked when they stepped in. There were 2 different officers, both male and white. They had lots of things on their uniforms, sticks hanging from their belt, radios and walkie-talkies, and they talked as they walked up to the front desk, and which they talked into as they walked up to the front desk, and guns. I stared at their guns. Mr. Yao quickly filled them in on what had happened. From the familiar way they had talked with him, it seems like they knew him. I wondered if the cops had been to the Calvista before. Mr. Yao handed them a list of the customers who had left in the middle of the night and told them he thought it was Mrs. Robinson who stole Mr. Loren's car. He went as far as to circle Mrs. Robinson's name and write the word black next to it. "And where is Mrs. Robinson now?" the officers asked. "She left, but I really don't think," I started to say. The officer cut me off with a stark shh. They only wanted to hear from Mr. Yao. Mr. Yao proceeded to tell the officers about the other customers. They seemed particularly interested in hearing about the Weekleys. "Are they home? Can we interview them?" "Absolutely," Mr. Yao said, leading the way. The Weekleys were outside talking about what had happened. At the sight of Mr. Yao walking over, Hank quickly moved his tomato plant into his room. Mr. Yao did not like Hank growing plants outside his room. He said Hank hadn't rented that space. The cops walked up to the Weekleys. "Would I like to ask you guys some questions?" the cops said. "How long have you been living here?" "About 3 months," Billy Bob said. "I was staying over at the days before." One of the officers turned to Hank and asked, "And you?" "About 6 months," Hank told him. The officer jotted it down. "Do you have a job?" he asked Hank. "Yeah, I work over at the gas station on Orange and Knott," he said. "What's this about?" Fred asked. "You think we did it?" Mrs. Q put her hand on her chest and let out a shrill, "Good God! Sir, ma'am, we're not saying that. We're just asking questions," the cop said. "But you're asking the wrong people," I interjected. They ignored me as they carried on interrogating the Weekleys. I kept trying to interrupt, but every time I tugged on their shirt, the police officer said, "Please don't touch me." Finally, they told the Weekleys that they could all go back into their rooms. As the Weekleys started walking back to the rooms, one of the officers pulled Hank aside. "Except for you," he said. "Why me?" Hank asked. "Because I said so," the cop said, staring Hank down. The Weekleys looked at Hank, and Hank looked at them. Then he nodded and told them to go on without him. After the other Weekleys left, both cops turned their attention back to Hank. "Now, where were we?" "You said you work at Orange and Knott." The commanding officer turned to the other cop. "Orange and Knott, let's check that out." He looked at Hank again. Have you been having any financial difficulties lately?" he asked. "Excuse me?" Hank asked. "Have you needed to borrow any money?" "No." "Have you sold anything in the last 10 weeks? The cops suddenly turned their attention to me. "Do people ever come over here looking for him? Does he ever ask you to hold something for him? Doesn't have to be big." I shook my head. "No." The officer seemed displeased with my answer and frowned. "I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to go back inside with your parents." "Hank's a good guy," I yelled as the officer took my arm and dragged me away. The whole time I looked back at Hank at the frustration and fury in his eyes. He said the words over and over. "I didn't do it." I sat with my nose pressed up against the window, watching the police interrogate Hank. Several times I tried to run outside, only to be escorted back in. "See? The police know I'm right," Mr. Yao said, taking their interrogation of Hank as evidence that the theory about black people was valid. He was wrong. The only thing it proved was that the police were just like him. I counted the minutes until his racist thoughts would finally leave. Surprisingly, the person who remained most calm throughout this whole incident was Mr. Lorenz. It sounded like he had car insurance and he figured that he could get the money back that way. At noon, the cops finally stopped interrogating Hank and got back in their cars. They didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest because he didn't do it. Duh. But they said that they'd be back. "You'll hear from us again real soon," the commanding officer, Officer Phillips, said. Looking at all of us, his eyes lingered especially long at Hank before he turned away. After the cops and Mr. Yao finally left, I went over to Hank's room. Hank was sitting in his chair, slumped over like a half-filled sack. He looked absolutely exhausted. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "It's all right," he said. "It's not all right. They were awful. They just assumed that you did it. How could they think that?" The more I thought about it, the more I got riled up. But Hank just sat there, quiet and unfazed, gazing in the general direction of the pool. The sun burned through the window. I could see little tiny particles of dust floating around in his room. "Why are you not more upset?" I asked him. He shrugged. "Guess I'm just used to it," he said. "This kind of thing happens all the time to me." "It does?" He nodded. "To all the black people in this country in some way or the other." He dropped his head into his hands. I sat very still, thinking about what he said. I could hear the faint honking of cars, people laughing in the room next to us. I wanted to scream, "Stop! Stop honking! Stop laughing!" How could it be business as usual when this was happening to people like Hank? Hank got up and went to wash his face. When he returned, he was holding a pack of Oreos. As he set the Oreos down on his little table, I stared at the cookies and thought about the world of difference there was between the two colors. All right, guys, until next time.